Okay, so we're back and let's talk about how we can explain social loafing through social impact theory. So, um, the characteristics of the observers can affect the performance. It's not just merely that there are other people there, there are factors about the other people who are observing who can affect the performance. So, for example, imagine that the person who's doing the performance is the target, and then each of these white circles represent observers, right? They're labeled sources on this diagram. So the strength of the source or the observer has an impact on the performance. So the bigger the circle is, the stronger the source is. And so let's say for a dance performance, the big circle is the judges, right? So they're probably one of the strongest impacts on performance. Whereas that small circle that's, it's closer to the target, but it's small, that might be your parents in the stands, right? Like that's not going to have as much of an impact on the person's performance as knowing that they're being, numerically judged, something like that. So, the distance of the observer can be important, but the strength can be really super important. Like, how important the target views the source as far as someone who's evaluating them can have a big impact on performance. The number of observers, having one other person watch you while you learn how to use a new computer program may not impact your behavior as much as having 6 people watch you. Now, with regard to social loafing, a really good example of social loafing is that if you have a lot of people watching you, you may be less likely to socially loaf because you at any given time you might be being watched by this larger group of people. So if for example, like I said, I always have my capstone students do their work in class, as they're analyzing data or whatever, I can help them. But when I have, let's say, 4 groups of students all working simultaneous on laptops trying to get their data analyzed, it's really, I'm the only observer. And if I'm over here trying to help this group set up a t-test, it's pretty easy for somebody in another group to take a moment to socially loaf and not contribute to the data analysis that their teammates are doing and, scroll their phone or something, right? Because I'm not watching them and I'm the only person who maybe they're worried about evaluation, maybe because I'm like the strongest evaluator. I would like to think that their group mates would be a factor and they would be like, well, there's 3 people sitting here and I'm scrolling my phone. That seems a little aversive to me. I wouldn't want to socially loaf in that situation. But, if you've just, as the person who's scrolling the phone, maybe you've kind of lost interest because the group isn't listening to your ideas or something. And so maybe, they're not a very strong observer for you. And knowing that there's only one observer who does matter, you realize they're not looking at you. Obviously, you can socially loaf. They're not going to catch you. But if there were, let's say I brought in some peers, some colleagues, and I'm like, okay, there's 4 groups and there's only one of me. So can 3 of my friends come in and watch whatever groups I'm not with at the moment to make sure that everybody's engaged and doing their work? Well, now the number is larger and it's a 1-to-1 correspondence, and the probability of being noticed if you're not contributing goes up. Suddenly I might not want to socially loaf because I'm being watched by another observer. So these factors are what we're talking about. And then immediacy is another factor. If you know that the repercussions of your social loafing aren't going to occur for weeks or months, then you might socially loaf in the meantime, because, the beauty of socially loafing is that you don't have to really do anything. And if the repercussions of not really doing anything are way down the road and the benefits of not doing anything are right now, well, the drive to socially loaf is the more immediate pressure. Whereas if the consequences are likely to occur right now, that's the immediate issue, well, then you're going to be less likely to socially loaf. Social loafing can oftentimes be very much, a procrastination thing. I don't feel like doing the work right now. I think I'll do it later. I'm planning to do it later, but I don't feel like it right now. And so if you have a very immediate judgment coming up, you can't really procrastinate in the face of that. You can't display that kind of social loafing in the face of that. Whereas if it's way in the future, you're like, that's a problem for future me. That's one of my favorite things to say around the house is it's like, you know what? I know I could probably deal with those dirty dishes, or I could deal with something right now, but you know what? That's a problem for future me. I'll deal with it later. And so if you can say, I'll deal with it later, you're more likely to socially loaf. All right. Another aspect of social loafing is when there are more targets for the source to be observing, you're going to get less of that, impact of observers, and less, it'll be less clear that the observers are contributing to the social loafing. I'm going to give you another dance team example, because one of the things that I loved about dance team is that I wasn't the only person out there. I never wanted to be the head leader because she had to perform by herself sometimes. I'm like, I'll do the captain's performance with 3 people. I will do the small team with 8 people. I will do the large team with 30 people. I will not do the one person where everybody's looking at me. No. I liked it better knowing that the observers had multiple people to look at. And at any given moment, if I made a mistake, they might be looking somewhere else. It always made me feel better. And so I think that's illustrated in this diagram, that if you have, a single source, or in the case of judges, you have, 3 or 5 people up there trying to watch 30 people, well, there's a possibility they're not looking at you, and you can kind of maybe do it half out for a second. Not do a full kick or whatever. And so, when there are more targets in our minds, we say to ourselves, maybe nobody will notice me in amongst all these targets. All right. Social loafing also is impacted by the availability of resources. So for example, I mentioned that in my capstone class, the students all have a laptop. I actually bring to class laptops that belong in the lab, spread them all out because they all have SPSS on them, which is a statistical package for analyzing data. And then, so we have one computer for each group, but each group is made up of 3, maximum 4 people. So that means one person's at the keyboard, maybe one person is reading data off of a piece of paper, and then you got 2 people who there's really not anything to be doing. So that would be sort of insufficient resources, right? If you have sufficient resources, if you're one of the person at the keyboard, or the person reading off the data from a piece of paper, well, you've got sufficient resources. So you're going to look at the task before you as like just a challenge, right? It's something that, you're being asked to do. Maybe it's a little bit outside of your skill set and you're learning, and it feels like a challenge, something that you can rise up to, as opposed to when there are insufficient resources. So maybe those 2 people who got left out, they weren't the reader or the typer. It may feel a little threatening, right? Because there's not enough for me. There's not what I need to be able to contribute to this group. And so it can feel like a threat. It can feel like a setup. Like I wasn't given what I need to be able to participate and contribute to the group. What I try to do to get around that problem is I say, okay, so one of you should type, one of you should read, and then the other 2 people should work together to start talking about how to populate your introduction section. And like I try and divide them up with something else to do, so that the non-typer, non-reader, those members are not left thinking there's insufficient resources, that there's nothing that they could do, so I might as well just scroll my phone and disengage and not be part of it. So availability of resources is a really big contributing factor to whether a person might decide it doesn't matter whether I'm even here, let alone whether I'm contributing. All right. Our next major topic, really, you can see how it kind of flows out of social loafing. Because if you think about social loafing being about feeling like nobody's going to notice that you're not contributing, well, deindividuation is very similar. You got to first off appreciate all the morphemes in this word. A morpheme is a little part of a word that has a meaning. So for example, D, right? That DE means, well, like another 2-letter word, or the reverse of, or something like that, right? Individ, well, that's, being your, an individual self, feeling like you're noticeable. And then ation is the process of that. So you're losing your sense of self. is basically what de-individuation means. I pulled some pictures just from the past year of situations where people have gotten de-individuated. And what I thought would be kind of interesting is just to look at these pictures that I pulled and look for some similarities and consistencies in the situations where people got de-individuated, where they lost their sense of self and ended up doing things that they would never normally do. So two of the pictures you'll notice are after dark and have fire and other things going on in the background. The lower left is Minneapolis during the burnings of Minneapolis in last June of 2020. And then on the right is Kenosha, and they also had fires burning and things like that. But I thought this was a better picture. So there's no fire visible, but nighttime is a really great time to get de-individuated, because under darkness, we oftentimes feel like we won't be recognized, or that people can't really see us. So darkness contributes to just a general sense of de-individuation. Then you add on, notice in, I don't think it's really super visible in the lower left. I see a couple people with masks in the lower left, but for sure the other three pictures, we've got masks. And some of them are, because of coronavirus, but some of them, like the top right, those are masks that would have been worn in 2018 by this group. I mean, this is just what this group does, is they put on helmets, they put on goggles, they put on masks, and then now you are completely de-individuated. No one can see your face. And when you can't see a person's face, it makes it more likely that they will experience de-individuation. It's really funny because since the coronavirus mask mandates, I kind of forget that I have a mask and sunglasses on, and forget that there is literally nothing identifiable on my face. And I walk around as if people would be able to see it's me. And my mom and I took a picture of ourselves. We lucked out and got to go to one of the spring Eastern football games. One of the players gave me his tickets, and I took my mom. We had to wear masks, and then it was sunny out, so I had my glasses on, and then it was really cold and kept sleeting on us. Like, this is April. What is happening here? So I had my hood up, and then we took a selfie. My mom's got a hat on and her sunglasses and her mask. I've got on my hood and my sunglasses and my mask. We take a selfie. We look at it. We're like, holy cow. Why do we even bother? There is nothing identifiable at all about us. But what was weird is from inside, I didn't feel de-individuated at all. I didn't feel like I was anonymous or anything. I felt like I given how the stadium was set up, where we had to sit 6 feet apart from each other and all these things, I felt very like individuated. I felt very much like there was a spotlight because we were out in the world and things. And so I had almost a reverse effect, but the premise is that the less you feel like people could identify you, the more de-individuated you may end up becoming, where you really lose your sense of self. So I don't know why that header says effects of others on individuals' performance when I'm going to define de-individuation. So I guess technically it's an effect on people's behavior, not really performance. I don't know. I made these slides, so I have no one to blame. So de-individuation, you can define it as people losing a sense of responsibility for their own actions. And so as a result, because they feel anonymous, they may do things that they wouldn't normally do if they really felt like people could identify them, if they felt like people could like look them in the eye, those kinds of things. So a lot of times you'll find that when a person is experiencing de-individuation, they will express aggression, or they might express sexual impulses. If you think about Mardi Gras, where everybody puts on a mask and drinks, that doesn't hurt. Suddenly we have, and Halloween, same thing. You have people who put on costumes and then they may follow through on their sexual impulses or on their aggressive impulses, and break things or, smash pumpkins or other things that people do when they have, costumes and masks on. De-individuation oftentimes emerges in a crowded situation. So all the pictures that I showed you, you'll notice that there were multiple people there, at the minimum, to, hundreds of people there at the maximum. being in a situation where it's anonymous, like the bigger the crowd, you don't even have to have your face covered. The bigger the crowd, the more you feel like I'm going to blend in, and who's even going to notice me in amongst these thousands of people, right? So you start to feel like you're more just part of the group and less yourself, less identifiable. Whoops. That was weird. So if you could be invisible for 24 hours and still just be your complete normal self, but just nobody can see you, what would you do? What would you do for 24 hours knowing that no one could ever know that that was you? Some little caveats. I mean, if you have to drive to get there, maybe you want to take an Uber because people might recognize your car. It's not invisible, just you are. So what would you do if you were invisible for 24 hours and nobody can hold you accountable for your behavior? 36% of college students, and coincidentally prisoners, gave deviant answers. So I don't think it's something unique to prisoners, right? It's not something unique to college students. Probably a lot of people would give some kind of deviant answer. And by deviant, I mean things like they would watch other people in intimate moments, or they would go steal something, or those kinds of not like socially inappropriate behaviors. Now, Phil Zimbardo in 1970 had people wearing KKK-like hoods. These are the actual picture from it. So it's not purely KKK, right? Like these are floral pillowcases that they cut nose and eyes out of. So they had people like this in pillowcases versus people with, just their normal face being shown. And they were given the opportunity to what they thought was shock another person. This was not, this was like the Milgram study. Nobody was really getting shocked. But they thought that they were going to shock somebody. And so they had the opportunity to turn the dial to whatever level they wanted to do. And they also got to choose which behaviors were deserving of a shock as a punishment. And what they found is that the people who had these hoods on shocked other people twice as often and actually at a higher voltage than the people whose faces were visible. So there's something about being, anonymous that makes people do, meaner things in this study. Now, the flip of this happened in 1979, where people wore surgical masks or had their faces fully visible. And the people who were wearing surgical masks actually shocked less than the people with the visible faces. And so we got kind of the inverse, where okay, so you can't necessarily see my face. Well, for one thing, I got pictures because I just wanted to distinguish between like complete anonymity in the Zimbardo study, right? Where it's a complete pillowcase. Maybe we could see your eyes, actually, like the eyeballs, but nothing about your eyebrows or anything else that would help to identify you. Versus in the Johnson and Downing study, we see, a lot of the face, just the mouth and nose are covered. So first off, they're not completely equivalent, but then we also have to throw in that, of course, a surgical mask is much more associated with somebody who does nice things, a nurse, a doctor, somebody who's going to help you, right? A paramedic, something like that. So the idea that when you don a mask like that, it actually makes you think, okay, I have to follow the Hippocratic Oath, right? I can first do no harm. Like that actually got sort of internalized into their mindset. And so they still weren't necessarily feeling like themselves. They were somewhat de-individuated, and they were putting on this persona of a person who does kind things. And so they actually were nicer than they would have been if their full face had been visible. I've been wondering how to sort of figure out how much that might have actually manifested itself over the past year with people wearing masks in public. Like, are people being nicer to each other, or are they being meaner? I know on airplanes there's a lot of tension surrounding, masking. But I'm wondering if, are we getting anonymity where a person feels like, well, I can cut in front of somebody else or do, at the grocery store or do other kinds of sort of outside the social norms, not nice stuff because I have a mask on? Or are they feeling more like, and a lot of us are walking around with surgical masks on. I, of course, have my homemade doofus, elastic around my ears kind of one that I made. But for those of you who are wearing surgical type masks that make you look kind of like a doctor, is it making you be nicer? I mean, I'm kind of wondering how could we quantify that? And I may have missed my chance to do it, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. But kind of an interesting question. So de-individuation increases in lots of different situations. I think I've been talking long enough, so I'm going to come back in the next section and we'll talk about factors that affect de-individuation.